Your faction's mightiest leaders have battled all this way. Yeah, right. You've battled all this way, and now finally it is time to make Garrosh atone for his crimes. He shall steal candy from babies no longer. This is the guide to Garrosh Hellscream in the Siege of Orgrimmar, and you will need 2 tanks, though how many DPS or healers you bring is up to you. I would say that having more DPS makes the fight a heck of a lot easier, so bring as few healers as you can possibly get away with. And now, on to the fight. This is a 3-phase fight, and you'll start in Phase 1. Garrosh will use Desecrate, which throws a desecrated weapon at a random player, creating a massive void zone with the weapon in the center. The weapon can be attacked, and the lower its health gets, the smaller the void zone will be, until the weapon is destroyed and the void zone disappears utterly. Garrosh will use Hellscream's War Song, which buffs the adds, and Garrosh increasing the damage they do. Tanks and healers should try to use cooldowns for these damage spikes, as they can get quite intense. Several adds will be spawning during this time from either side of the room: Kor'kron Warbringers and Farseer Wolf Riders. The Warbringers use Hamstring, which deals damage and slows their current tank, and the Farseers will cast Chain Lightning and Ancestral Chain Heal. Each time one of their casts is interrupted, they gain a stacking buff of 25% increased casting speed. Every so often 2 Siege Engineers will spawn. They will begin channeling a spell to activate the Iron Star next to them, one on each side of the room. A DPS should be assigned to kill one of the Siege Engineers to prevent them from firing off an Iron Star. The Iron Stars, when fired, will roll across half the room, dealing massive damage to anything in its path, and when it hits the other side of the room it will explode, dealing damage to the entire raid, and the damage is lower the further away from the impact players are. The Iron Star will also deal damage to adds caught in its path. So, for Phase 1, you want 1 tank to take Garrosh in the center of the room, while the other tank picks up all the adds. A tank swap during Phase 1 is not needed, as there is no stacking debuff to worry about. The Warbringer adds should be AoE down to about 50% health, while the Shamans should be nuked down, and their Ancestral Chain Heals should be interrupted. Do not interrupt the Chain Lightning. 1 DPS will have to take out the Siege Engineer to stop the Iron Star from rolling along, and players should avoid the other Iron Star, and if possible use knockback effects on the adds to push them into the path of the Iron Star, and if they are below half health it should kill them. To deal with the Desecrate, you should have 2 markers set up, and Ranged should stack on 1 marker, then a Desecrate lands there, and Ranged should move to the other stack point. Some Ranged can DPS down the Desecrated weapon, and make it safe to move to the marker when the next Desecrate lands, and then they just have to go back and forth like that. Players should try not to be too close to where the Iron Star crashes into the wall so as to reduce the damage. You don't have to be radically far away, about the middle of the room should be good. When Garrosh reaches 10% health, he will roleplay a little, heal up to full health, and then the transition will begin. Try to kill all the adds before the transition if you can, as it will make it a lot easier when you get back. The transition area will be one of 3 possible areas. The main idea is to run through to the end, killing all the adds on the way. You should have the raid split into 2 even groups for 2 of the possible areas, and then 1 group can handle the left-hand side and the other the right-hand side. Upon killing adds, little golden domes will spawn, which when stood on will burst and buff the players standing inside, reducing the damage they take. The area with lots of small adds will spawn small domes that individual players can activate and get buffs from. The area with medium adds will spawn medium-sized domes that 2 players should go into at the same time to get the buff, and the one with the 2 large adds will buff 5 players each. With the 2 large ones, where the dome will appear is shown by a yellow impact marker, and all players on that side should stack up on that impact marker so that everyone gets the buff. Until you've dealt with all of the adds, Garrosh is immune to all damage and is absorbing energy from the heart of Yasaj. Once all the adds are dead, Garrosh becomes active, and players can do some damage to him. During this, he will spam a frontal cone attack called Annihilate in random directions, which will deal insane damage to anyone hit by it, and less damage to everyone not hit. The damage during this is very, very high, and so all players should have the buff for it. If they do not, then they need to be using cooldowns, and healers should be giving them priority. The difference in damage between having and not having the buff is extreme, so if you have the buff you can easily be healed through this, and if you do not have it, it can be touch and go, especially if several players are missing the buff. Tanks are the lowest on priority for getting the buff, so they should leave the small domes for other players to pick up until everyone else has a buff. While avoiding the frontal cone, it helps to stand close to Garrosh, as it is easier to avoid if you are closer to him. Once the transition is over, Garrosh will be at full health, less what you did to him in the transition, and you will no longer have to face the Siege Engineers or the other adds from Phase 1, though Garrosh will have several more abilities now. Garrosh also has an energy bar and will have gained energy while you dealt with the adds in Phase 1. As his energy gets higher, so his abilities will become empowered, making them much more dangerous. Every so often during Phase 2, Garrosh will bring everyone to the Transition Realm where he can gain more energy, meaning the faster you kill both Garrosh and the adds, the easier he will be during this phase, as fewer of his abilities will become empowered. So, first let's look at the abilities and then how to deal with them. During this phase, he will use Whirling Corruption. He will spin around and deal damage to the entire raid, and the damage is lower the further away the players are from Garrosh. Tanks can still stand next to him, but the rest of the raid should be stacked up away from him and should be using defensive and healing cooldowns. When he reaches 25 energy, Whirling Corruption will become empowered, and this will cause him to deal extra damage to players and create adds called a Minion of Usage. When killed, they will buff any nearby minions, healing them to full and buffing them with 200% more health and damage. This stacks and needs to be avoided. He will also use Touch of Usage, which is a mind control that he will use on several players. While mind controlled, the players will cast the mind control on other players. Garrosh can't be interrupted, but the players can and must be interrupted to prevent it from getting out of control. The mind control will be broken once the players have been DPS down to 20% health. Make sure not to use dots, as you don't want players dying after the mind control has been broken from dot damage. At 50 energy, this ability becomes empowered and works the same way, except the players will look like Shah, will have more health, and cannot be CC'd, so no stuns or anything will work when empowered. Desecrate works the same way as earlier. He launches the axe and it creates a giant pool of ick that you want to avoid and DPS down the weapon to get rid of. At 75 energy, Desecrate becomes empowered, making the weapons immune to damage, so the giant pools of ick become permanent. Garrosh's final ability is Gripping Despair, which is a stacking dot he will put on the tank. The tank should swap at 3 stacks. We found due to the speed at which the stacks were applied, Garrosh would sometimes become taunt immune because of the constant swapping, so make sure not to taunt earlier than 3 stacks, as you may need to wait longer if Garrosh is becoming taunt immune. At 100 energy, Gripping Despair becomes empowered. This causes explosive despair whenever the debuff falls off in any way. This deals more damage the higher the stacks of the debuff before falling off, and applies a debuff that increases damage from this effect by 10% per stack that fell off. From my experience, this deals damage and applies the debuff to the entire raid, meaning that tanks can't swap much or they will kill the raid. You really want to try and get into Phase 2 with as little energy on Garrosh as possible. The lower his energy, the easier this phase will be. Now what we did here was much the same as in Phase 1, as the ranged would be stacked on the markers and move back and forth with a Desecrate. However, when a Desecrate hits and just before the mind control, everyone would move in and stack on top of Garrosh. Then he would use Touch of Usage, and we would DPS the players out of it, and then ranged could move away again just in time for the Whirling Corruption. When Whirling Corruption is empowered, players need to avoid the impact markers showing where the bolts will land. Each time one of these lands, an add will spawn there. Players should separate these adds by attacking them for aggro or even using taunts. Once they are alone, they can be DPS down and killed. It is very important that they be separated before being killed. If an add does get buffed, then a tank should pick it up, but if the adds aren't separated properly, they will even kill the tanks. It is very important, and players must handle it correctly, or this fight will be much harder than it should be. The adds are probably the thing that your group will have the most trouble with. For the empowered mind control, not much changes except it becomes a bit more difficult. When Desecrate is empowered, the floor is going to get covered in the ick, making it more and more difficult. Try to avoid having this get empowered in Phase 2. When Gripping Despair is empowered, tanks need to be extremely careful. What we did was we swapped once at not very many stacks and then just left the boss on the tank to prevent more damage from that. It doesn't seem to count a tank death as the stacks falling off, so we just left it on one tank until he died and then the other tank took it. This is something you want to avoid during Phase 2. Once he reaches 10% health in Phase 2, he will heal up to 25% health, and all of his abilities will become empowered. The strategy is the same as Phase 2, except all the abilities are empowered, and you need to be using Bloodlust during this phase, though depending on your DPS, you may be able to use it right at the start, and then again for Phase 3. And then just nuke him down for a kill, and that's it for Garrosh Hellscream. Now the faction leaders can quickly swoop in to claim the credit. I hope this guide helps you out, and for more guides, check out the description for links to playlists. Good luck, and have fun.